League of Legends has been releasing champions for over 15 years, and for almost every one of those 15 years, there's been at least one release that's been problematic. Sometimes it was a champion who deleted you before you could react, sometimes it was a champion whose design felt as though they had been specifically made to be annoying, and sometimes it was a champion who was breaking the entire game because nobody really understood what they were doing.
What?
This is every year of League of Legends history, and one champion released from each year that the community remembers as being the worst. We're going to take this from the start all the way back in 2009. League, of course, launching in 2009 had the largest roster ever back then in a single year. It came out with 40 champions, so there is a lot to pick from here. But I think out of every champion from that original release year, the one that stands out the most to me has to be Kassadin. His Q back then was a point-and-click silence, his WA mana restoring empowered auto attack, his EA stacking slow, but the real problem for Kassadin has always been his ultimate Rift Walk. At max rank it had a base cooldown of 4 seconds at rank 3, and back then you could get up to 40% cooldown reduction, so he was blinking pretty much every few seconds if he wanted to, and of course when he used his ultimate many times in a row, each time he did its mana cost would increase, but it would also deal more damage. So you build a ton of items around that, such as Rod of Ages for example. He's always been infamous for his weak early game. Even back in 2009 his early game was bad, but once he had items and levels, the combination of a dash on such a low cooldown with massive AP scaling and a point and click silence made him just impossible to deal with. Riot themselves noted in patch notes around his 2014 mini rework that his old kit left the victims with very few to no options against him, especially when he snowballed ahead. And back then there were numbers that backed that up. People called him Kassa-Win, not Kassadin, and he infamously had a 99% ban ratio in solo queue and across pro play as well. All in all, if you ever let Kassadin into your game, it felt as though you were rolling the dice whether or not you were going to win, even more so than you already do. 2010 also saw a ton of new champion releases, with around 28 new ones being added to the roster, and my pick for this year is Irelia. She was a champion that people initially dismissed as being not very good, you know, and then people started playing her and they started building her correctly, and it turned out that this champion was a big problem. In fact, I'd say Irelia was one of the original overloaded kit champions. Her passive Ionian Fervor gave her up to 40% tenacity based on how outnumbered she was, so whenever you're ganking or outnumbering Irelia, you're putting her at her strongest point, which is a bit counterintuitive. Her W hit and style passively healed on every basic attack, and when activated did bonus true damage. Her E was a point and click slow, but if she had less percentage health than you, it would turn into a stun, and her ultimate fired off a bunch of blades in a line that did some damage and healed. Not to forget her Q, of course, Blade Surge, which is pretty similar to how it is now. You just dash to something and if you kill it, you get your cooldown back. If you put all that together though, you have a champion with tenacity, a gap closer, true damage, healing, and hard CC. She just had a little bit of everything. Of course, the famous meme better nerf Irelia did come from somewhere, because she kept appearing in patch notes even when arguably she wasn't that strong anymore, but in her release year she was an absolute terror of a champion and very much deserves a spot here. 2011 was perhaps the last year where Riot went crazy with champion releases and were regularly flooding the Rift with new additions. Though for 2011 there's one pick which stands up above everything else for me, and that was a brand new fishy assassin, Fizz. The core of Fizz's frustration has and always will be his E ability, Playful Trickster. Even back then it worked the same way, which it pretty much always has done. You press E, Fizz hops up onto his trident, and you can let the ability wait out to do more damage or reactivate it instantly for less damage. And originally on Fizz's release version, this ability had an 8-second cooldown at maximum rank, and that's before we take into account things such as cooldown reduction or building a Zhonya's Hourglass to waste time in between the cooldown resetting. This may not seem as crazy by today's standards, but you have to remember back then there was a lot less mobility in the game, and having this untargetability on a basic was, I think, something that no other champion really had at the time. This gave Fizz an edge and just made him incredibly annoying to deal with. But then you add in the rest of Fizz's kit and he starts to become even more of a nightmare. His Q was a targeted dash, as it still is now, his W applied a non-hit bleed effect, and his ultimate was much the the same, where you throw out a fish, it instantly attaches to somebody and deals damage in a larger area depending on how far it's travelled. Again, back then squishy champions were just more squishy. You didn't have supports who were able to be tanky like they are now either. Fizz historically, because of how he plays, is one of those champions in League of Legends that isn't allowed to be good. His frustration ceiling is simply too high for Riot to let him sit in a strong spot for any length of time. Players knew it very much from the moment they started to play against Fizz, and that's a reputation which has always followed him since. And speaking of champions that aren't allowed to be good, that brings us on to 2012 very nicely. 2012 can only be described as the year of the assassin. I don't know what Riot were doing, but I guess they decided we needed more of this subclass within the game. 2012 was when we had Rengar and Kha'Zix introduced to the game, for example, and they were both completely busted in their original state, and one of them would have very likely been the pick here, were it not for another assassin introduced in 2012, and that was Zed. And Zed, on his release, was an absolute monster. Back then, his R-Def mark would store 50% of all damage dealt during its window, meaning Zed really didn't have to do much more than auto-attack you a few times and press E, and you'd be going back to the fountain. The speed of his W, Living Shadow, was insanely fast compared to how it is now. Add on top of this, his ratios were better across the board, defensive itemization for carries wasn't as good back then, and you kind of get the picture. This champion was just way too good at what he did. The numbers for the Season 3 World Championship pretty much told us the story. Zed had a 100% presence throughout the tournament. This means he was picked or banned in every single game. People were saying at the time he is by far and away the most feared champion in the tournament, with nearly double the ban rate of champions tied for second. And that fear is absolutely justified. Did you know it was also in 2013 OGN Spring Final Game 5 where the infamous Zed vs Zed, Ryu vs Faker game happened, where Faker pulled out probably what is one of the most famous clips in League of Legends history.
Tries to clean it up for Ryu. Oh, look at the cleanse, look at the moves! Faker, what was that? Faker with a huge play, the QSS!
More recently, Riot lead designer Riot August stated publicly in 2023 during a live stream that Zed is intentionally kept in a weak state because he is one of the most frustrating champions in the game to play against. He consistently posts high ban rates despite sitting often below a 50% win rate in solo queue, because ultimately, as fun as assassins are to play, they are often miserable to play against, and nobody exemplifies that better than Zed. So I think it's a pretty easy pick for 2012 here. And if Zed seemed like a fairly easy pick for 2012, 2013 is a complete no-brainer. This may be the easiest pick in the entire video, by the way, because in December of 2013, Yasuo released. Pretty much immediately it became apparent this guy was completely busted. He was taking a physical melee distance carry to the absolute brink of its limits. I mean, think about the melee carries we had before, such as Master Yi, where he just Qs on you and then autos you and hopes you die before you kill him. Yasuo was a whole other beast. He had a shield on his passive, his Q that would build up into a knockup, his E allowing tons of dashes, his ultimate, which back then by the way had a much larger range, you could ult people from miles away, and of course perhaps his most frustrating ability, Wind Wall, which has always felt like a very controversial ability to put on a super high damage melee carry. Back when Yasuo first released, people were crazy about playing him. This was a brand new super flashy melee hyper carry, everyone wanted to play him, though his ban rate was huge as well. In fact, he was one of those champions that people were already banning just because they didn't want to see him on their team or the enemy team. Because infamous as ever was the Yasuo 10 death power spike, where he just feeds and feeds and feeds, and then suddenly he hits 2 items, gets 3 or 4 kills in a fight, and now suddenly he's unstoppable. There are a bunch of reasons why Yasuo is a hated champion and a loved one for many other people, and that's why he's controversial and absolutely deserves a space on this list. Heading into 2014, Riot were going to try out another mechanic which they had never done in this game before. Now on paper it sounded completely broken, and then this mechanic got taken into the game and, as expected, it ended up being completely broken, and I'm talking here about Kalista. What made Kalista such a problem is and always has been her passive, Martial Poise. This makes it so when you auto-attack, you can instantly dash in a direction of your choice. Except back when she first came out, she was quickly given changes post-launch to make this passive even better, such as you moving further when you jump backwards, or your passive scaling harder with attack speed. In the hands of skilled players, she just became absolutely uncatchable and undealable with if she got ahead. You'd play something that engages, you'd manage to get on her, she'd survive it through defensive itemization and supports, and then she'd attack 2 or 3 times and she'd built that distance up once again. And this wasn't like other ADs with mobility like Ezreal or Tristana or Corki or whatever. She just had this mobility turned on constantly. Fighting Kalista felt kind of like fighting Vayne when she has her ultimate on, where it's as if you're on a timer where you have to beat her before she gets too many resets with her Q and just beats you. Except again with Kalista, the timer was always active, and of course she was building up stacks for her E-Rend, which was another powerful part of her kit. It worked the same way it pretty much always has. You throw spears into a target, they gain a stacking debuff, you activate Rend, and you rip all those spears out doing tons of damage. Or you could also throw your Q through a target and Rend would go to another target behind them. This made Kalista equally good at taking down squishy targets trying to dive her, or she could just make tanks look like a porcupine that had so many spikes sticking out of them. Then again, she was amazing at taking high health objectives such as Dragon or Baron because she could just put so many stacks into them. The stats from the 2015 World Championship tell you everything you need to know. She ended the tournament with roughly a 70% presence, being the most played and contested AD in the event, and letting her through always felt like such a massive risk which teams just didn't need to take on themselves. Nowadays Kalista has undergone many nerfs to put her in a more sensible state, but her passive has proven to be a mechanic which has been pretty much impossible to balance. 2015 brought in such an interesting champion release, and ultimately the one that's going to be my pick for this year, and that is Tahm Kench. Now there is one massive difference you need to know about Tahm Kench and his release state, and in fact how he worked for quite a few years afterwards, and that was his Devour used to be his W, and back then his W had 2 modes. For allies it functioned as a pocket mechanic, where he would swallow a teammate making them untargetable, and then he was able to carry them a short distance before spitting them out again. He could also use this on enemies too, though he did need 3 stacks of his auto attack passive on them at the same time. His ultimate on the other hand was Abyssal Voyage, which was kind of like how Ryze's ultimate is now, where he would start a channel to a location and a bunch of people could click on him, jump inside his mouth, and then they'd be teleported to the location. But the real big deal here was having Devour on W. This was the ultimate anti-engage tool. There was nothing that's ever been better than this in the game, I don't think. At a press of a button, you eat your AD carry or your mid laner or just any squishy character on your team, and the enemy cannot interact with them whatsoever. They're just removed from the rift for a few seconds. And at maximum rank, Devour used to last for, get this, 6 seconds on allies. It was half of that on enemies. I mean, it is 6 seconds of your ally not doing anything in a fight either, but if they're getting dived and they don't have any defensive, then this is the ultimate line of defense. You just can't do anything about that. Tahm Kench's Devour made him very popular in pro play, basically immediately. You had a bunch of immobile carries that would pair super well with Tahm Kench, such as Jinx, Kog'Maw, or Ashe for example. And if pro players let Tahm Kench through, they were basically signing a paper saying, yeah, we're okay with you playing a hyper carry at the same time. And at Worlds 2015, Tahm Kench was banned 20 times and picked 14 times, finishing with a 71% win rate. For a champion that released in the same year, these are some pretty incredible stats. Of course, in 2021, Tahm Kench had his mini rework, where his ultimate and W were swapped around, though I swear even after this rework he remains super strong and annoying to deal with.
Oh my god, what does he even do, man? What does he even do? What's the counterplay?
He's still got that incredible Devour utility, and his W just gives him some nice mobility, to be honest. And above all, with Tahm Kench, he just does deceptively large amounts of damage for a champion that's so tanky and has so much utility. Either way, for so many reasons, Tahm Kench gets the spot for 2015. 2016, by comparison, was a pretty chill year overall for releases, and here I've gone for Camille. Camille was a top lane bruiser or engaged champion, though at times with the damage she dealt, she felt more like an an assassin. One of the problems was on her Q and how powerful it was at launch. Similar to how it's always been, you'd use Q once and then you could reactivate it shortly after. When you reactivated it, the bonus damage was doubled between up to 100% of your total AD as true damage. And along with Sheen procs, this would just do way too much damage.
Wait, I took 1.5 thousand true damage? Bro, my HP bar is 1.5k max. Holy f, they need to remove Quinn from the game. God damn.
She got shields which would be modified against the type of damage she was taking, her E gave her a ton of mobility, and her R Hextech ultimatum allowed her to single out one particular champion. Compared to a lot of the other top lane picks at that point in time, she was simply better and did more things with her kit. And whenever Camille gets even a little bit ahead, it feels like she engages on you and just half of your health magically disappears instantly. Though she definitely wasn't as bad as some other picks on this list, I think she overall deserves the spot for 2016. For 2017 though, we're going back to another properly controversial champion, and that was one that arrived quite late in the year, Zoe. In many ways with Zoe, it felt as though Riot had brought a mechanic back into the game which they had got rid of, and that was how Nidalee's spear used to work, where the further it travelled the more damage it would deal. This was kind of seen as annoying to deal with and frustrating, and now here we have Zoe instead with her paddle star, who can throw it backwards, redirect it, portal jump, and then do an absolutely massive chunk of damage. Except this damage was also AoE. Another super annoying thing about her was her Sleepy Trouble Bubble, and this honestly is one of the main offenders. It was a skill shot that put enemies to sleep and would travel additional distance when used across terrain. But the thing was, even if you missed this ability, it just went on the floor and blocked the area for a bit. Usually if you miss a skill shot, you aren't rewarded anyway, but not Zoe apparently. And then there was her W Spell Thief. This let Zoe pick up summoner spells occasionally dropped by enemy minions or champions, and on Zoe's release, minions could drop teleport. And there's no way to say how tilting it was to see the enemy mid laner randomly get a free teleport occasionally. If this happened, you kind of just lost the lane. She could go in for a super dumb trade and then no, she could just teleport back 20 or 30 seconds later. Zoe would undergo some big nerfs shortly after release in patch 8.4. In this patch, they lowered her paddle star damage by 20% and also made it so E didn't refund some of its cooldown anymore when you hit it, because why was that ever a thing in the first place? At the time, Riot lead designer Medler admitted that this is a time where we should have made changes earlier, though it would take many nerfs to come before Zoe was eventually in a reasonable place, though in the hands of Wantrix or in pro play, she still makes the occasional appearance to remind you how annoying she is. 2018 is unique for this list because it's the only time that a champion rework will be making the cut. Oftentimes when something dumb and broken comes out, it's a completely new champion to League of Legends, but in this case a full retooling of a champion might as well have been a new introduction to the game, and in 2018 it was the brand new Akali. So her new defining mechanic was her W Twilight Shroud. This gave her what Riot originally described as true stealth, a form of invisibility that even turrets couldn't see through. When she used W, she was untargetable by everything in the game. This first version of rework Akali could turret dive you and you did not have any turret to protect you. This was just an unbelievably dumb thing to have ever put in the game. This had to have been limit testing or something from Riot. There's no way they actually thought this was a good idea. Oh, and on top of that, her Q, when you used it with high energy, would heal a bunch as well, and the first cast of her R would stun you for half a second. She just had so much power built into her kit, it was unreasonably good. At the 2018 World Championship, she posted up a 72% win rate and was banned 51 times, the highest ban count of the entire tournament. During her pick, she was picked 5 times top and mid 6, making her dominant across 2 roles. Of course, Riot would go into turbo nerf mode with this clearly broken re-release. First her Q healing was removed, then the turret stealth interaction was removed on the same patch, and finally they'd remove the stun from her ultimate as well. But even many years later, Akali is still an absolute terror if she ever gets a little bit ahead. This is one of those champions who can just be super annoying to deal with and seems to do insane levels of damage for how tanky she is. All in all though, for 2018, the reworked Akali is a pretty easy pick. And from one easy pick, we're going to an even easier one in 2019. If there was any champion apart from Yasuo, which is a complete no-brainer, it's this one, because 2019 brought out Yuumi. Yumi was a completely experimental champion within League of Legends, where instead of playing as an individual champion, you would attach onto an ally and you would support them with various abilities, movement speed boosts, heals, and so on. I suppose the risk was supposed to be you're putting your life in that person's hands, and if they mess up, you are also going to die, but it just ended up being way too good and overtuned. I mean, sure, sometimes your AD sucks, the lane doesn't go well, but it didn't really matter for Yumi. Once the mid game started, she could just latch onto whoever was doing well. Was it your mid laner? Was it your jungler? Your top laner? It doesn't matter. She just hops onto them and provides endless amounts of utility. On top of that, she could skip out on boots, saving a bunch of gold. She could take 2 offensive summoner spells because she didn't really need flash. Her life was in someone else's hands. And in time, Riot would even say the combination of Yumi's enchanter level defenses, hyperscaling identity, access to powerful engage tools, and untargetability create the perfect storm for frustrating gameplay with little to no means of counterplay. Eventually at Worlds 2021, she was the most banned champion in the entire tournament, and years later, Riot would deliberately completely gut her kit in advance of a mini rework just so people stopped playing her. The rework came shortly afterwards and did improve things, but I think at the end of the day, some champion experiments were just never really meant to be, and having an untargetable support I think is something which can never really be healthy. So I said before of Akali, she was the only champion rework to feature here, but in some ways you could say my pick for 2020 was almost supposed to be a rework, but it really wasn't. She ended up being a new champion. That might let you know who I'm talking about. For 2020, I have gone with Seraphine. The moment that news started to drop about the starry-eyed songstress, the comparisons were impossible to miss with Sona. Both are mages, both built similar kind of items, both have a passive that stacks up, both have heals and speed boosts, and a crowd control ability on their ultimate that they fire in a straight line. The amount of similarities shared between these champions was something that really upset people even before she came out. Before she came out, LS called her Super Sona 2.0, and T1's official account was tweeting out memes about her. Seraphine's champion spotlight became the most disliked in League of Legends history. It was the first champion to receive considerably more dislikes than likes, accumulating today around 150,000 dislikes. Thematically, this champion was just not well liked from any angle. Her lore generated its own controversy. The kit similarities with Sona. Pretty much all of the picks on this list are because of how champions were on the Rift, because they were annoying to play against or frustrating. For Seraphine, the problem started the moment she hit the PBE, but ultimately I think she deserves the spot for 2020. For 2021, we have Akshan, the Rogue Sentinel, who was released midway through this year. He was one of League's first intentionally designed mid-lane marksmen. Not to say that other champions haven't already done this, but Riot really did try to make a champion specifically to do this with Akshan. And Akshan's kit was, well, it was overloaded if we're putting it nicely. One of the most questionable parts of his kit was always the passive on his W going rogue. This made it so whenever an enemy champion killed one of Akshan's allies, they were marked as a scoundrel. And then if Akshan then kills the scoundrel, he revives every ally who was killed by that enemy simultaneously. And at launch, that revive even persisted after Akshan had died. As long as he had damaged the scoundrel within the last few seconds, everyone on your team would revive. Riot even admitted with Akshan they were being very cautious because of how potentially overloaded his kit was. And after release, his win rate was really not very good. But I think overall Akshan is an easy champion to find annoying, with his weird resurrection being part of his kit, his E having him swing about, and his ability to snowball all making him a problem. 2022 was one hell of a year for controversial champion releases. K'Sante, the king of the top lane, absolutely deserves a mention here. If we're talking overloaded kits, kind of nobody beats this guy in that regards. Even many years later, he is still being picked so regularly in professional play. However, there was one other champion release this year who I think was even more of a problem for more of the player base, and that was Zeri. Again, as we've seen with a bunch of champions here, Riot tried something completely unique with this new marksman, and that was having her auto attack be a skill shot rather than just something you right click and hit people with. On top of that, her passive back then, Living Battery, had two separate mechanics working together. Whenever Zeri damaged an enemy shield, she would absorb 60% of that damage as a shield of her own. So essentially, if there were any shields on the enemy team, they were just free stats for Zeri. On top of that, when Zeri herself received a shield from any source, she would gain some movement speed. And then when you combine that with the ultimate and how it gave her so much movement speed, she could just become unbelievably difficult to deal with. The problem was exacerbated by enchanters popular in 2022 such as Yuumi, Lulu, or just supports that use Moonstone. Basically, if you could just spam shields on her, she would carry your team. Zeri and Yuumi together hit a 55% win rate as a bot lane duo, and Riot League designer Frojan eventually acknowledged publicly that the two were impossible to balance together, and that values often contradict one another. If Zeri got ahead, she would snowball out of control into a hypermobile tanky DPS machine, and even if you saw Zeri get a single kill early game, it would just feel like GG straight away. Zeri was particularly problematic in professional play, where people would play patiently enough through her relatively weak early game, get her a few items, and then just absolutely steamroll the enemy team. She was looking like another one of those picks that was going to be weak in solo queue, but super broken in professional hands.
Yeah, Zeri's win rate in solo queue is really low. I don't know. These are like, it has the Ryze conundrum and the LeBlanc conundrum where it's just broken in pro play, but it can be useless in solo queue, so it's like unbalanceable, this champ.
And so Riot would nerf her again and again throughout 2022 and 23, but nothing was quite hitting her hard enough. Eventually Riot came in full swing with the nerf bat, completely removing the shield interactions from Living Battery and making it so her Q burst fire didn't proc Spellblade anymore. And leading up to this in LPL Summer 2023, she still had a 100% presence at this tournament. And after this and many more nerfs, Zeri was finally moving down to a more acceptable place. 2023 was, by the standards of this list, the least controversial year in League of Legends history for champion releases. We had Milio, Neferi, and Briar all came out, and all of them released in a kind of okay state where they weren't really that crazy or anything. But there was a fourth champion that released this year, and it's probably going to have to be the pick here, despite even not really being that bad, and that was Hwei. I think when people initially saw Hwei on the PBE and videos start to pop up about him, that they were worried about another Aphelios incident where no one really has a clue what the hell this champion is doing, he's just pressing buttons and randomly one-shotting you. Hwei in total came with 10 different abilities where he'd have to open his spellbook from using his Q through E, and then have to pick another ability to decide what his basic was gonna be. His disaster spellbook was centered around damage, Serenity, healing and utility, and Torment crowd control. He also was nerfed time and time again during the PBE as he was just massively overstatted and dealt far too much damage. On his release, Hwei was good but nowhere near as terrifying or confusing as Aphelios. Still, I think to this day he's a bit intimidating to play as first time or play against if you really haven't taken some time to look into his kit. So for that reason I think I'm gonna have to pick Hwei for 2023. For 2024, however, don't worry, we're getting back to things being super easy once again, because late on in this year we had Ambessa release, and pretty much immediately people's eyes went rolling when they saw what her passive Drake Hound step did. After Ambessa used an ability, she could instantly dash in that direction. This was a level of mobility creep which we had just really never seen in this game before, unless you are counting Kalista of course, who could jump on every single auto attack, but dashing on every single ability was its whole own thing. It was like Riven on steroids, but with just a much more overloaded kit. In some ways it was the end of the mobility creep arc. I mean, you can't get a champion that's more mobile than either Ambessa or Kalista, can you? But it wasn't just her mobility, this champion just dealt an absolute ton of damage after she had picked up one item. In pro play she's seen a ton of play in top and in the jungle as well more recently. There are some champions that have abilities that everyone knows are just going to be busted. They come out and they end up being even more broken than expected. And for 2024, Ambessa is absolutely the pick. And here we are at the end of the list in 2025, and it's another champion introduced from Arcane. And once again, this is a super easy pick. Mel. You know, in recent memory, Mel has probably been one of the most hated champions in League of Legends history, which is honestly impressive that Riot have managed to pull this off so many years later. Mel's single biggest problem has always been her W rebuttal, and if Yasuo was a problem because his W win will destroy projectiles, well, Mel was like Super Yasuo, because on Mel you press her W rebuttal, she becomes immune to damage for a brief window and reflects all incoming projectiles back at enemies. The counterplay in theory was just don't hit her when she's using this ability, but oftentimes she could hold it so long to a point where you couldn't use an ability because she could reflect it back at you so easily. So ultimately it felt as though you couldn't outplay Mel when she was holding onto her W. It was on the Mel player to use it suboptimally rather than for you to find a window where she can't use it. On top of that, how she played was just really annoying. Her Q poke was super long range and would gradually chip you down. She had a root, and her ultimate could execute you from miles away if she got too many stacks on you. But the main thing to know about Mel, and this is the hallmark of a champion that's frustrating to play against, is that she simultaneously had a super high ban rate and a below 50% win rate. People just did not want to play against this brand new champion because her playstyle was so frustrating. Her W just deleted parts of your abilities and threw them back at you, and laning against her was constantly just getting chipped away. Riot designer Amisery openly admitted in January of 2026 that the team underestimated how frustrating the play against experience for Mel would be. And more recently, Riot have been on a crusade to nerf Mel down to a more acceptable state. But honestly, I think whilst rebuttal is reflecting projectiles, you're gonna have a pretty difficult time doing that. And there we have it, every single year from 2009 to 2025. 16 years of League and 16 champions that have made people lose their minds. And I don't know if you noticed, but one designer was responsible for Yasuo, Kalista, Zoe, and the rework to Kali. Certainly T, you sure know how to make some interesting champion picks, that's all I'm gonna say. But what do you think though? Are there any champions here that you are surprised didn't make the list, or that you would have definitely included instead? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.